I want you to imagine this. It's a quiet Tuesday morning. You're sitting at your kitchen table holding a cup of coffee that's gone cold. Outside, the world is moving like nothing happened. Cars driving past, kids walking to school, birds doing whatever birds do in October. But inside your chest, there's a hole the size of everything. 3 weeks earlier, my father died. His name was Robert, and to me, he was the most honest man I had ever known. He was the kind of man who returned extra change to cashiers, the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday. He coached my junior softball team even though he knew nothing about softball, just because I asked him to. He made terrible pasta every Sunday and called it his special recipe. And I ate it, every time, because the look on his face when I did was worth every bad bite. He was my person, my safe place, my home. And then he was gone. A sudden heart attack at 62. No warning, no goodbye. Just gone. Like a candle someone blew out mid-sentence. I flew back home for the funeral. I held my mother's hand through the whole thing. I gave the eulogy. I told everyone that my father was a good man, and I meant every word. But what I didn't know that day was that I was eulogizing a man I had never actually met. It started with a letter. About 2 weeks after the funeral, my mother called me, her voice flat, strange, like she was reading from a script she hadn't rehearsed enough. "Isabel, there's something you need to come home for. A lawyer called. He says your father had accounts in Switzerland, in Geneva." I remember thinking she must have misheard something. Geneva? My dad was a retired high school geography teacher from a small town in Ohio. He drove a 12-year-old Buick. He clipped grocery coupons. He did not have accounts in Switzerland. But she wasn't wrong. 3 days later, I was sitting across from a lawyer named Mr. Voss in a glass office in Columbus. He had a folder in front of him, thick, stamped with a Swiss banking logo, and he slid it across the desk toward me with the kind of practiced calmness that told me he had done this before, that this wasn't the first broken family he had sat across from. I opened the folder, and the world I had built my entire identity around, quietly, invisibly, collapsed. Inside was a financial statement. The account held over $2 million. It had been opened 23 years ago, right around the time I turned 7, right around the time my parents almost divorced. But there was something else in that folder, something that made the money feel almost irrelevant. There was a name on the secondary account holder line. It wasn't my mother's name. It was a woman named Claire Fontaine, and she lived in Geneva. I looked up at the lawyer, and I think he knew, just by looking at my face, that I was only at the beginning of whatever this was going to cost me. I didn't tell my mother what I had found. Not at first. How do you look at a woman who just buried her husband of 35 years, a woman who was already barely holding herself together, and say, "I think Dad had a secret life"? How do you do that to someone who loved him the way she did? So instead, I did something I'm not entirely proud of. I bought a plane ticket to Geneva. I know, I should have talked to someone, I should have waited, but grief doesn't make rational decisions, does it? Grief makes you chase things. Grief tells you that you need answers the way you need oxygen. So I chased. I found Claire Fontaine's address through a property record linked to the account documents. She lived in a small, beautiful apartment near Lake Geneva, the kind of place that looks like it belongs on a postcard. I stood outside her building for almost an hour before I knocked. She answered the door on the third knock. She was maybe 60 years old, elegant, with silver hair pulled back softly. She took one look at me and her face went white. "You look exactly like him," she whispered. "You must be Isabel." She knew my name. She had always known my name. I stepped inside, I sat down, and for the next 3 hours, a stranger told me things about my father that I will never be able to unhear. Claire and my father had met at an international educators conference in Paris 24 years ago. They had fallen in love. Deeply, she said. Genuinely, she believed. They had spent 2 weeks together, and then my father had gone home, gone back to us, and ended it. He had ended it completely, no contact for years. But then, about a year later, he had reached out again, not to restart the relationship, she was careful to say, but because something had happened, something he couldn't tell my mother, something that had changed everything. She paused, looked at her hands, and then looked up at me with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life. He came back to tell me I was pregnant, that I had given birth and kept the baby. He wanted to know, he needed to know, and once he knew, he couldn't walk away completely. I couldn't speak. She reached across the coffee table and placed a photograph in my hands. A young man, maybe 22, dark eyes, a familiar jaw, a smile I recognized from every Sunday morning of my childhood. His name is Luca, she said softly. He's your brother. I want to tell you that I handled that moment with grace. I want to tell you I was calm, measured, mature, but I wasn't. I cried in that stranger's apartment in Geneva for almost an hour, not from anger, though that came later, but from grief, from the strange, dizzying grief of losing your father twice, once to death and once to truth. Because here's what shattered me most, and I need you to hear this part carefully. My father, the man I thought I knew completely, had carried this alone for 20 years, and I had to decide what to do with that. I flew home. I sat with the truth for 2 weeks before I said a single word to anyone. And then, one quiet evening, I told my mother everything. I had been terrified of that moment. I had rehearsed it 100 times. I had imagined her falling apart, screaming, shutting down entirely. But here is what actually happened, and this is the part that changed me. She listened to everything. Her face moved through 100 emotions I don't have names for. When I finished, she was silent for a very long time. And then she said, quietly, I always wondered why he never wanted to talk about that conference in Paris. I asked him once, years ago. He changed the subject so gently I almost didn't notice. Almost. She had known or felt something for years. She had chosen to trust him anyway. She had chosen the life they'd built and the man she believed him to be, even when the edges didn't quite add up. She cried, of course she did. I held her while she did. But she didn't collapse. She didn't shatter. She was sadder than I had ever seen her, but she was still standing. Here's where things shifted in ways I never saw coming. About a month later, I got a message on social media from Luca. Claire had told him I had visited. He had processed it, and then, carefully, tentatively, he had reached out. We exchanged messages for weeks before we video called. I didn't know what to expect. I had spent so long being angry at the idea of him, angry at what his existence represented, that I had almost forgotten he was just a person who had grown up without a father present, a person who had only found out the full truth when a stranger knocked on his mother's door in Geneva. He was not what I had imagined. He was kind, he was quiet, he was funny in a dry, understated way that made something ache behind my ribs because it was so familiar, because it was my father's sense of humor living in a face I had never seen before. On our third video call, he said something I had not expected. I don't know what you need from me, or if you need anything at all, but I want you to know, whatever he was to you, he was something to me too, even at a distance. Even through my mother's stories, he was something real. And I thought about my father, the man who coached a softball team he didn't understand, who made terrible pasta and beamed when we ate it,
who carried an impossible weight for 20 years without letting it crush the people around him. Was he perfect? No, not even close. What he did was wrong in ways that deserve to be named. He built a hidden world. He denied my mother a truth that was hers to know. He deprived Luca of a father who was present. He robbed all of us, in different ways, of something real. But he was also a man who didn't abandon a child, who quietly, stubbornly, insisted on taking responsibility, even in secret, even imperfectly, even when it cost him peace of mind every single day of the last 2 decades of his life. I've thought about this story more times than I can count, and here is what I've come to believe. The people we love most, the people we build our entire sense of safety around, are also just people, full of contradiction, full of mistakes wrapped inside good intentions, full of secrets they were too ashamed or too afraid or too broken to share. That doesn't make the betrayal not real. It doesn't erase the grief of finding out your father was someone different than you thought. But it means that love, real love, is bigger and messier and more complicated than the clean version we hold in our memories. My father's secret didn't destroy me, it expanded me. Painfully, slowly, but it did. Because I have a brother now, and on some Sunday mornings we video call and we talk about a man we both loved, in different ways from different distances, and we grieve him together in the only language we share. And sometimes, if I close my eyes and listen closely enough, I can almost hear him in the silence between our words, still carrying something, still trying to do right, still, impossibly, both the man I knew and the man I didn't. If you've ever loved someone who kept secrets from you, I want you to know, the truth doesn't have to end the love. Sometimes it just asks the love to grow bigger, and sometimes, somehow, it does. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needed to hear it today, and I'll see you in the next one.